I often tell founders is if you kind of know you're going to do this company, like you made a decision, like yes, I'm absolutely going to do this. And to me, go ahead and form the company at that point. Yes, maybe you can wait a little longer, but if you kind of know this is something you're going to go do, I think it's a good thing to get in place, and it serves a lot of purposes to protect the company. Please.
How many slides are available? Are these slides already being available?
I emailed them to Shauna, so she's welcome to provide them to you guys.
Okay, so from the company, so right now I rented the private company in California compared to Delaware or Nevada or somewhere else.
Great question. So California, if you're in California, it's often going to be the cheapest just to form a California company. And for a lot of early stage companies that are cost conscious, that's a significant reason to think about. Most startups that I work with actually form in Delaware, and which I know a lot of people. And the reason is, one is they're just a lot easier to work with on an administrative level than California. Like when you, for example, when you raise money, you need to amend your certificate of incorporation. Delaware will turn stuff around really quickly, and California often takes a long, long time. And so it gets hold of financing process and various things, and people get very frustrated with that.
I was surprised when I went to a pretty well-known website and I had a company that's actually registered and within a version or something like that.
Yeah.
They have a comment.
No, it's very prevalent. A lot of Asia-based companies have a parent company in Cayman's or British Virgin Islands. Very typical, and for a couple reasons. One is those islands have kind of developed their corporate establishments intentionally to kind of grow that business, so it's fairly easy to work with. They have fairly lenient tax regimes, and it's easy to move money in and out. So yeah, a lot of international investors would prefer that they invest in those types of entities rather than putting their money directly into various countries, for example, that might have currency restrictions or other things where they prefer an easier place to invest. I have this gets into one of the later slides. Some companies also do it for tax reasons. They have very low or zero corporate tax rates, so sometimes you'll put your intellectual property assets in an offshore jurisdiction like one of them, and use that as kind of a customer entity that sells to customers, and then you may have a very low corporate tax rate. Great. Okay, so one of the things I mentioned that I've been doing a lot of is cross-border, and I know sorry, I didn't catch your name, but you just mentioned an example of lots of businesses are having employees or consultants in multiple jurisdictions. Very, very typical nowadays, and it does raise it raises interesting issues, because while the internet and everything, the ability to work mobile, it has certainly cross-border without being very easy, kind of these legal systems haven't exactly caught up. So you got kind of a few things to think through, and there's often some tension between what's quickest and most cost-efficient to do versus what may, if this becomes a real profitable business, what would be the long-term tax optimization country to headquarter in. So often there's tension with that. A lot of, from a U.S. perspective, a lot of companies here, even though they'll have employees in Silicon Valley, they may have employees in India, Israel, China, wherever, they may still just do a U.S. parent company because access to the capital markets here, venture capital, it's a very stable legal system, and even though it has very high tax rates in the U.S., a lot of these companies don't anticipate having profits, at least for the immediate term, and paying taxes. So a lot of startups that I work with just say, look, I understand it could be more tax advantageous to go incorporate somewhere outside the U.S., but they don't want to spend the money and the complexity to do that, so a lot of them, the vast majority, just incorporate here. We certainly are seeing a lot, in my practice, I see a lot of companies where the parent company is not in the U.S. Again, that's a minority, but I see a fair amount. Parent company is BVI or Cayman or Israel or India, and interestingly, investors have become a lot more used to that. And there's been, there's been more and more examples of these companies raising money from U.S. venture capital firms or even going public in the U.S. And so it's still, I think still, it's not like the same universe of, not every U.S. investor will put money into a parent company, for example, but more and more have. And so there's definitely a general trend towards investors being more accepting of the broader universe of companies here. It does create a whole host of issues like what country, even if the headquarters is in the U.S., if most of the IP development is being done outside the U.S., where does it make sense to put the IP? And that is very relevant from a tax standpoint, and also how you will be interfacing with customers, or an entity will be interfacing with customers. I think a lot of what drives this decision is where do you intend to raise capital, where do you intend to headquarter the company, put the management team, and also where do you think your biggest markets are going to be. And so some of that you don't know everything on day one, but you have to make some educated guesses about that and just kind of decide what you want to do. You can't right away change. Like I certainly have had companies, one company I worked with, they were actually a Danish parent company, and the U.S. venture capital came in and said, I want you to the U.S. parent company, so they flipped it to the U.S. parent company. So you certainly can change things. The hard thing to change is once you put your intellectual property in the U.S., it's very difficult to move it out later, at least with whatever existing IP you have. That said, that tends not to be a huge factor for startups, but if you think, like I have one client that's selling mostly outside the U.S., and so that company raised, well, if you're going to be selling, if your markets are not going to be mainly the U.S., then really think about whether the IP should be outside the U.S., because then it may make a real tax difference.